Today, Wednesday, 21st August, I find myself again returning to the topic of the conflict in Ukraine, because even though lots is going on in many places, it is the conflict in Ukraine which dominates international headlines and which continues to shape the international environment, though perhaps at some point over the next few weeks and months, events in the Middle East will take over as the big shaping event. But for the moment, it continues to be the conflict in Ukraine. Now, yesterday in my program, I discussed at some length two rather extraordinary facts about the conflict. One was that I returned to the topic of the negotiations, which the Washington Post claimed had been underway between the Russians and Ukrainians about seeking a mutual cessation in the energy war that the two are waging against each other. This has been a topic that many people have discussed, and I said that I was starting to get the sense that what has been happening, based on comments that Russian officials, including most specifically Sergei Lavrov, have been saying, is that the Russians very unhappily and very grudgingly have been maneuvered or have been pushed towards some kind of talks with the Ukrainians at a very, very minimal level up to now, which they see as a trap, the one in which the Ukrainians essentially are trying to move the Russians towards some kind of acceptance of Zelensky's peace formula, so-called peace formula, which is in effect a demand for Russia's capitulation. That, it seemed to me, was what Lavrov was saying, and I went on to say that it was clear to me, or at least I felt, that the Russians felt they had been put under some pressure from some of their friends, China, India, Brazil, perhaps most pertinently, to engage the Ukrainians in negotiations, which the Russians felt was ultimately a trap for them. The Ukrainians were really manipulating Russia's allies, stringing them along in order to try to get negotiations started on a basis completely different from the one that the Russians themselves would have wanted to engage in. And I also discussed the military situation, and I expressed puzzlement about the overall military situation. It seemed to me that Ukraine was going all in, supporting its operations in Kursk, and in the process seemed to be sacrificing the whole of Donbass and ultimately eastern Ukraine, something which I found completely baffling, but which seemed, on the basis of the events in Donbass, in places like Pokrovsk, Toretsk, near Siversk, Chasiv Yar, Kupiansk, all of these places we've been talking about for so long. Anyway, it seemed to me that looking at the situation in these places, it was almost like that, as if the Ukrainians, or at least the Ukrainian leadership in Kiev, had basically given up on Donbass, even as they were trying to draw the Russians into negotiations. In other words, even as they were trying to win the war, which they were losing militarily, to try to win it through some kind of diplomatic strategy. And even as they were doubling and tripling and quadrupling down on their adventure in Kursk. Well, that was what I said in my program yesterday. And lo and behold, two very important and very interesting people have come out and made very interesting comments shortly after I made my video, and both of which were published I think around the time when my video was actually was also published. Anyway, two very important people have made comments which seem to me, if I may make so bold, to rather corroborate the points I was making in my program yesterday. Let's begin with the first one, which is about negotiations, and it has been made by Dmitry Medvedev, former Russian president, former Russian prime minister, currently deputy head of the Security Council, Russia's most important policy-making body, a person who continues to have apparently some role in monitoring the work of Russia's military-industrial complex, and the leader of the ruling party, the United Russia Party, of which, by the way, rather amazingly, Putin himself is not actually a member. But I'm not going to get into the minutiae and strangeness of that in this program. Anyway, Medvedev has positioned himself over the entire course of the special military operation as an arch hawk. He's somebody who quite clearly wants to see Ukraine completely destroyed, who's clearly not at all keen on the idea of talks, and who wants war to be conducted by the Russians against Ukraine until total victory is achieved. And all of this must be borne in mind when considering these comments which he has just made. And I'm going to read what he's written, and it is on his Telegram channel. Now, the Russian authorities, by the way, I ought to say, even though, as I said, these are Medvedev's comments on his Telegram channel, they're taking it sufficiently seriously that they are reproducing these comments and giving them a high degree of attention. Parts of them, or extracts from them, the most important parts, have been republished by the official Russian news agency, TASS. But I'm going to go to Medvedev's own words, obviously in translation. And this is what he said. Recently, even theoretically, there has been one danger, a negotiating trap into which our country could fall under certain circumstances, namely early unnecessary peace talks proposed by the international community and imposed on the Kiev regime, with unclear prospects and consequences. After the enemy, he uses a much stronger word, committed an act of terrorism in the Kursk region, everything fell into place. The idle chatter of unauthorized mediators on the subject of a beautiful world has stopped. Now everyone understands everything, even if they do not say it out loud. They understand that there will be no more negotiations until the complete defeat of the enemy. So let a certain individual he makes some rather crude physical descriptions, from the country where the terrorist operation was being prepared, not be happy about it. His country has done a lot worse than the territory of ex-Ukraine under his charge. There will be much more senselessness and senselessness. I'm not going to discuss who this person with the white hair from the country where the terrorist operation was being prepared was. I think we can all guess that he's somebody not that far from the Oval Office. But anyway, let's move away from that. Here we see Medvedev, in effect, confirming that the Russians were coming under pressure from some of their friends to begin negotiations, which the Russians themselves judged to be ill-conceived and premature, and which they saw as a trap. And the Kursk operation has now blown this apart. Even countries, and again, it's not difficult to guess which ones, China, India, and Brazil would have been the leaders, even countries which up to now have been keen on getting some kind of negotiating process underway, now understand that it cannot happen, and that far from this being a problem from the Russians, this is actually a good thing. Notice that Medvedev is not completely excluding the possibility of negotiations. He's saying that negotiations now would be premature, that in effect what he is saying, that so long as the present government, the one led by Zelensky, remains in control in Kiev, the Ukrainians will inevitably try to shift the whole discussion back to Zelensky's peace formula, which is not what the Russians have any interest in talking about at all. So, from a Russian point of view, it makes no sense to conduct negotiations now. Maybe if and when the situation in Kiev changes, and of course Medvedev has talked many times about the need for regime change in Kiev. He's talked about that before any other Russian official has done. Anyway, maybe once that happens and a new government is in place, one which, as the Russians would say, is agreement capable, then the topic of negotiations can be reopened. But for the moment, it would be a very, very bad idea indeed from a Russian point of view, and for that reason, they don't want to do it. So that's Medvedev's view, and as I said, it corresponds exactly with the spirit of what Lavrov was saying yesterday. The Russians, furious as I suspect they are at some level about the Kursk operation, nonetheless, deep down, see it as an escape from a negotiating trap that they did not want to be led into. So that was Medvedev talking about negotiations. And notice that just as I spoke yesterday about a potential trap, that the negotiations that the Ukrainians had been trying to set up looked like a potential trap, Medvedev uses the same word. He also refers to the negotiations, or at least the format of the negotiations that the Ukrainians were trying to set up, as a trap. Now, the other person who has made some very interesting comments, indeed, is Mariana Bezuglaya, the Ukrainian MP, one of the most interesting and difficult to understand personalities, in my opinion, in the entire Ukrainian war. I'm gradually coming round to the view that Bezuglaya is not, as many people at one point thought, a cat's paw for Zelensky, doing his work in the parliament to try to undermine Zelensky's rivals, people like Zhelanne. I've gradually come round to the view that Bezuglaya is actually sincere, that her criticisms of the military and of their conduct, the Ukrainian military, and of their conduct of the war are sincere. And of course, she has recently quit Zelensky's party, the Servants of the People Party. And she now stands, or she rather sits in the Ukrainian parliament, if that is the right word, as an independent MP. Now, if she really is acting for herself, in other words, if she really is independent of factions, which would be an extremely unusual thing in Ukrainian politics, then I have to say this: she's a very courageous person indeed. That's the first thing. One who's prepared to say things that perhaps others with less willpower and courage might leave unsaid. Anyway, she's obviously a very brave person indeed. And frankly, she comes across to me in that case as the only sane individual in what is starting to look like a ship of fools. Now I say this, I'm not entirely sure what to make of Bezuglaya, and I'm not going to say more. But anyway, this is what she said yesterday, and it touches on my points yesterday about the whole conduct of the war and the way in which the Ukrainians seem to be in the process of giving up completely on Donbass, as if the heart of the battle, for the Ukrainian leadership at least, has gone. They no longer have any real belief that they can defend Donbass, and they're only going through the motions of trying. Anyway, this is what Bezuglaya said. Ukrainian armed forces are being withdrawn from Donetsk Oblast, leaving entire strips of the front to their fate. Our units are being withdrawn from there. Ammunition is not being added. The Russians are passing through empty fortifications. In such circumstances, the occupation of Pokrovsk is a matter of the near future, and Toretsk is living out its last days. It looks as if we are giving up Donetsk region. Beyond Pokrovsk is the direct route to Pavlograd, where there are no fortifications at all. And then there is the Dnieper. Beyond Toretsk is the Kramatorsk agglomeration, and then there is Kharkov region. No equipment has been installed for the administrative border of the Donetsk region. That's what Bezuglaya said, that the Ukrainians are no longer defending themselves effectively in Donbass, that the heart has gone out of the fight, or at least the ability to conduct the fight appears to have gone, and that the Russians are advancing almost effortlessly through fortified positions which once upon a time, not so long ago, looked virtually impregnable. Now, to give an illustration of this, let me go to something that was written as recently as the 25th of May by Big Serge, one of the most astute commentators of the Ukrainian conflict. And someone who, by the way, I'm going to return to further in this program, because he's written a most interesting piece on the Kursk operation. Anyway, this is what Big Serge was saying as recently as the 25th of May. Toretsk and New York are both strongly held and very well fortified settlements. They have been held continuously by the Ukrainian army since 2014 and are accordingly amongst the best fortified positions on the map. Russia will clearly aim to avoid a head-on assault, and they are well positioned to do so. And then Big Serge, on the 25th of May, went into a lengthy discussion about how the best approach for the Russians, the one they were almost certain to take, was to attack from Ocheretino and Klishevka and to bypass Toretsk and New York and to encircle, or at least threaten with encirclement, the Ukrainian troops there. And by the way, lest anybody think that I'm criticizing Big Serge, I'm not, because at the time when that article was written, I completely agreed with him. I too thought that that was what the Russians were going to do. Well, since then, and we're just a few weeks away from the writing of that article, consider what has happened. The Russians have carried out a head-on assault on Toretsk and New York. The Russian Defense Ministry confirmed yesterday that New York has been completely captured. So have all of the other places, the other important villages around Toretsk. Zaliznie, Pivnitchne, Shumer, all of them have fallen rapidly under Russian control. The Russians apparently now control both coal mines, and this morning they've apparently advanced further inside Toretsk itself, and they are pushing through the village of Druzhba to the northeast of Pivnitchne, to the northeast of Toretsk itself. There's been a complete collapse, and as Redovka wrote some weeks back, in fact, the Ukrainian fortifications in this area, fortifications which the Ukrainians took so much trouble and so much time to construct, are barely being defended. The Russians are cutting through them at astonishing speed. And for the record, I've been keeping an eye out on what Media Zona's calculations of Russian casualties are. One might have expected that with all of these offensive operations that the Russians are conducting, that there would be a massive spike in Russian losses. And that, it turns out, isn't the case at all. So the Russians are advancing fast in Toretsk, where some of the most elaborate fortifications were, and the Ukrainians are not defending, or at least not defending at all well. The contrast with what was the case earlier in the war, when there was the battles in Bakhmut and Avdiivka, when it took the Russians months, or Marinka even more, when it took the Russians months to capture a few fortified positions and to move a couple of 100 meters forward, is really startling. And, well, I'm going to discuss the whole Pokrovsk situation in more detail later in this program, but it's the same there also. A couple of days ago, lots of stories and accounts about how before the Russians reached the villages of Novogrodivka and the town of Selidovo, there was a whole impassable barrier made up of slag heaps and coal mines. I'm going to anticipate by saying that according to the very latest reports, which it must be said are not fully confirmed, those coal mines and those slag heaps are not being defended, and the Russians are pushing through them. So, what are we to conclude from all of this? It's becoming clear to me that decision-making in Kiev is taking a highly eccentric turn. The Ukrainians, instead of defending and committing all their forces to hold back the Russians on the front that matters, are instead continuing to double down on the front which is the least important, which is the one in Kursk. Now, yesterday, I read a report on the Russian news agency TASS, in which a senior military officer, he was not identified, apparently briefed TASS that the Ukrainians were redeploying some of their best units from the Donbass, from the front lines in Donbass, including from places like Pokrovsk to Sumy and Kursk region, in order to keep the offensive in Kursk going. This despite the fact that the defense lines in Pokrovsk and Toretsk and Siversk and all of these other places were rapidly collapsing. And yesterday, last night, after I did my program, and by the way, after it was published, Redovka, Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, very nationalistic, very patriotic, strongly supports the war, but actually generally factual in its reports and with access to the Russian military itself, and also employing some extremely insightful commentators. Anyway, they identified one of the military units which Ukraine has redeployed over the last 36 hours from Pakrovsk, from the area of Pakrovsk, to Sumy and Kursk region. And Medvedev is saying that the 47th Mechanized Brigade is the unit that has been deployed. Now, this is on its face quite extraordinary. The 47th Mechanized Brigade is, by most accounts, the most elite brigade in the Ukrainian armed forces. It was created and trained by the Western powers in the winter of 2022-2023 and equipped with Leopard 2s and tanks and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles in order to break through Russian defenses in Rabotino during the period of the summer 2023 offensive. It was going to be the spearhead brigade. They was going to smash through the Russian defenses, open the way to Tokmak, the town of Tokmak, and then from Tokmak, the Ukrainian advance would continue all the way to Melitopol, and ultimately to the Black Sea. Of course, it was defeated, but it retained its reputation as an elite brigade. It was then redeployed to Berdichi near Avdiivka. It fought intense battles with the Russians for control of Berdichi and the village of Stepovoy. I remember discussing this at enormous detail a few weeks ago, a few months ago. It seems like an age now. And then they continued to be the major brigade trying to stem the Russian advance westwards towards Pakrovsk. And this elite brigade, what's left of it, with its Abrams tanks, the Leopard 2s at some point were replaced with Abrams tanks, though quite a few of them have now been destroyed. Anyway, it seems that what's left of this elite brigade has been redeployed from Pakrovsk, according to Regatta, to Sumy and Kursk region. Now, I ought to say, of course, this is a report from Regatta. I don't have any corroboration of it, but I'm going to guess that it's true. It is the same kind of, it is consistent with other information that we're getting about what the Ukrainians have been doing in the Sumy and Kursk area. That they're continuing to redeploy troops from the Donbass to the Kursk area. And as Regatta said, the redeployment of this brigade has dealt a critical blow to the cohesion of the defences around Pakrovsk and is one of the key reasons why the Russians have been able to push forward in the Pakrovsk area so fast. And on that topic, today, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that the village of Zhelanne, once apparently an important command position, previously used by the Ukrainians. Anyway, they confirm that Zhelanne has actually been captured and that the Russians have completed the capture of this place. As a result of active actions, the units of the Center Group of Forces have liberated Zhelanne, Donetsk People's Republic. Now, other reports, almost certainly correct reports, are saying that the Russians have now pushed well beyond Zhelanne, that they are in fact rapidly advancing in all sorts of other places in this area, that they've now captured the village of Komishevka. They previously had captured Novogrodivka and Zavitne, which are to the west. Having captured Komishevka, they've presumably also captured the village of Mercouris, which is to the east of Komishevka, that they're pushing now towards Ptiche, another village, and then Kalinovo. If they reach Kalinovo, then they will have reached the main highway in the area, the M04 highway, which links Karlovka to the south with Mirnograd and Pokrovsk. And of course, if the Russians reach that highway, there's some who optimistically think that the highway could form a defensive barrier. I have to say that seems extremely unlikely to me. It would certainly mean, I'm guessing, that the Ukrainians are going to have to pull back from Karlovka, but it's likely at that point that the Russians will be in a position to do the very things that the Ukrainian oligarch Rinat Akhmetov was saying: bypass the coal mines and the slag heaps that lie east of Selidovo and Novogrodivka, and attack Selidovo itself from the south. Now, in saying all of that, I ought to say that there are reports that the Russians are actually pushing faster, and that they've actually broken through, as I said, this line of coal mines and slag heaps, that they were minimally defended by the Ukrainian army, that 2 slag heaps are already under Russian control, that the Russians are close to Selidovo itself, in fact that they've captured a slag heap that overlooks Selidovo, and that they're now in a position, having broken through this line of coal mines and slag heaps, that they're now in a position to attack the village of Novogrodivka with its high-rise buildings, that they're in a position to attack it from 3 directions, and that an assault on Novogrodivka is likely at some point within the next few days. Now, if Novogrodivka falls, then it seems to me, looking at a map, inconceivable that the Ukrainians would be able to defend themselves in Selidovo. And from what I can see, looking at the map again, it looks to me as if Selidovo itself would fall fairly quickly. We're talking about a town of 10,000 people. I doubt that it is heavily fortified. Bezuglaya suggests not, in which case Selidovo falls, and the entire Ukrainian defense position to the south, Kurakovo, places like what's left of the Krasnogorovka, the western, the streets that jut out from Krasnogorovka to the west, and ultimately Vuhledar itself become undefendable, and the Ukrainians have to pull out of all of these places, which, by the way, given the operative philosophy of the Ukrainian leadership, they might not do. But anyway, to repeat again, the fall of Selidovo would be a disaster. And yesterday, I read news, again, it's not easy to confirm this, that the Russians have in fact made significant progress in the fight for Grodivka. Grodivka, a village on the way to Pokrovsk. It's the last big village on the way to Pokrovsk along the highway from Progress. The Ukrainians supposedly are putting up a big fight to try and hold Grodivka. One of their mechanized brigades, and I believe an airborne unit, paratroopers, were deployed to Grodivka. But the Russians are attacking Grodivka now from multiple directions, and it seems likely that Grodivka will be captured by the Russians fairly soon. Once Novogrodivka falls, I think the collapse of Ukrainian defenses in Grodivka itself will become unavoidable. And then the way is open to Pokrovsk. And Bezuglaya is all but telling us that Pokrovsk itself is undefended and that there is no real will to defend it. Notice how she also talks about the possibilities of a Russian advance westwards from Pokrovsk, along the main road from Pokrovsk, all the way to Pavlograd, where she says that there are no fortified positions at all. And from what I understand, the road in question, the E50 road, is, by Ukrainian standards, a wide metalled highway. Russian forces would be able to move quickly along this road. It'd be difficult to withstand them. They might find themselves in Pavlograd fairly quickly, despite the fact that it must be said that there is a considerable distance between Pokrovsk and Pavlograd. Anyway, let's not push it forward too far. Let's not look at things too far ahead. But we can see that in Toretsk and Pokrovsk, things are not looking at all good. And Selidovo, according to the accounts I'm getting this morning, Selidovo and Novogrodivka are in the situation there for the Ukrainians is getting worse and worse. Now, this morning, as it happens, there's been a cascade of commentary from various Russian commentators about the situation in and around Siversk. And this is where, of course, the Russians captured the other day the Vimka railway station, which brings them not only very close to Siversk, but also apparently puts them on the same plateau as the one on which Siversk itself is located. And our old friend, Andrei Marochko, former official of the Lugansk People's Republic, now a commentator discussing things with TASS and other Russian media outlets. Anyway, he's come and he tells us about the current situation around Siversk. He says, in the Siversk direction, the military command of the Ukrainian armed formations is trying to avoid the encirclement of its units. After our forces advanced successfully in the area of Ivano-Darivka and the Vemka railway station, the Ukrainian military command has begun to hastily pull back its troops in the northwest direction. And he also says that the Ukrainians have rushed additional artillery units to the community of Zvanovka to provide themselves with some artillery cover for their retreating troops. And he went on to say that Russia's battleground south units have begun to envelop the Ukrainian army grouping stationed in the west of Lugansk region. In other words, they've begun an envelopment operation of Siversk itself, which might be likely to fall, according to this, fairly soon. Anyway, that's our old friend Marochko. That is what he tells us. And, well, for all I know, he's absolutely right. It seems logical. I don't see any reason to doubt what he says. There's also been all kinds of news pouring out from the Kupiansk area that the Ukrainians are gradually pulling back now, that they've come to some kind of a decision to pull their forces to the west bank of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. And as I said, in the village of Makeyevka, which is not, by the way, to be confused with the much more important town of Makeyevka, basically the western part of Donetsk city, the eastern part, of Donetsk city. Anyway, in the village of Makeyevka, we know for a fact, because we have pictures and film, that the Russians have crossed the Zherebets River and are already fighting the Ukrainians there. So, a very catastrophic situation for the Ukrainians in Donbass. It's getting worse, probably by the hour. And Bezuglaya is saying the same thing that I said yesterday, that it looks as if, at least for the moment, the Ukrainians have all but given up the battle there. That, by the way, if it is true, does rather beg the question of what exactly it is that the Ukrainians are thinking of doing. If they're no longer prepared to defend Donbass, if they recognize that Donbass is lost, then logically they ought to be doing something that was suggested to me some weeks ago now, some months ago in fact, by one of the many insightful commentators I am privileged to receive emails from, who suggested that what the Ukrainians needed to start doing at that point, I should say this person has a military background, what the Ukrainians needed to start doing was to prepare for a fighting withdrawal to the Dnieper River and to cross the Dnieper River to the west bank of the Dnieper that they themselves control. Well, that was some months ago. There's no indications that the Ukrainians have tried anything like that. They haven't tried it. They haven't done it for the moment. And even as they're losing momentum in the battle in Donbass, even as the Russians are now taking more and more territory, faster and faster, I don't really see any sign of them doing that, even now. Instead, what they're doing is shuttling some of their forces from one part of their territory east of the Dnieper to another. In other words, they're moving their forces from the central and southern areas of eastern Ukraine, from the Donbass to Sumy region, so that they can continue to support their offensive there. And the offensive in Kursk region continues after a fashion. Now, here I'm going to make a number of an important point before I start getting into the weeds about what's going on in the Kursk offensive, and in fact discuss some of the commentaries about it. I think one of the major errors that some people are making about the fighting in Kursk is that they're describing the battleground there using their experience of the battleground in Donbass. Donbass is, as I've discussed many times, a dense territory. There are lots of towns, some cities, and villages, and these can be fairly substantial places of 1,000 or 2,000 people, coal mining places, many of them with industrial buildings. The place is crisscrossed by railways, which provide, and roads, which provide obviously good means of communication, but also are natural fortified barriers. The railways especially are. There are also lots of industrial buildings and coal mines and slag heaps and things like that, which can be converted quite rapidly and effectively into strong fortresses. And of course, the Ukrainians have been in possession of this territory ever since 1991, or most of this territory ever since 1991. And in the contested areas where the war has been fought over. They've had since 2014 to develop powerful defences, and that is precisely what they have done. Kursk is completely different, and the most interesting description of it that I have seen so far, and one provided by someone with a military eye, it has been provided by Jim Webb. Now, just to remind people who Jim Webb is a former US Marine officer. Last summer, he wrote a truly outstanding and very insightful article together with George Beebe, the former top CIA analyst in charge of Russia analysis. Anyway, they suggested, this is back in 2023, in the relatively early stages of Ukraine's counteroffensive, they pointed out the counteroffensive wasn't going anywhere. The time had come for the Ukrainians to start rethinking this offensive strategy. They suggested that instead of throwing away men and machines on an offensive that was generally failing, what the Ukrainians needed to do was to pull back, build fortified lines, comparable in some respects to those that the Russians had created, the so-called Surovikin line, and use the time that those fortifications gave them to prepare a good strategy for negotiations. I thought at the time that this was one of the very rare flashes of not just good sense. You read lots of articles which are full of good sense, but actually good advice extended to the Ukrainians and to their allies. Had that advice been followed then, Ukraine would be in a very different position today from the one in which it is in now. And as I said many times, if that advice had been anticipated, if that had been done, what Webb and Beebe said had been done before the offensive was launched, in fact, in place of the offensive. If, in other words, Ukraine in the winter of 2022-2023 had opted for a defensive rather than an offensive strategy, its position would have been better still. Anyway, I say all of this because, as is clear, I think Jim Webb is one of the most intelligent commentators discussing the war, and I think his grasp of the military realities is extremely sure. And bear in mind, I say that he's a former Marine officer, and as I've discussed many times, I am not a military person in any shape or form. Prior to this war, I had little interest. I would perhaps correct that. I had no interest to speak of in military matters. So it's always gratifying, therefore, to listen to advice from someone who actually is a military expert and who knows what he's talking about and who makes obvious sense. Anyway, having explained who Jim Webb is and the fact that he talks with authority, look at what he says about Kursk region, the area which Ukraine is attacking now. And he makes this point. By choosing to focus on Ukraine's territorial gains in Kursk, the Western media is once again trying to spin to win, not to be confused with the baseball term of taking a massive cut at a pitch. Well, I don't know anything about baseball. I know even less about baseball than I used to know about military matters, just saying. And then he goes on to say this. We're told that 74 settlements are now in Ukrainian hands. But what does that mean? If you look at the demographics of the Kursk Oblast, it's clear it's meaningless. Barely 1 million people inhabit the Oblast. The Oblast is the region. And a whopping 36 people inhabit each square kilometre. By comparison, Kursk is less than half the size of Missouri, with 1/6 of Missouri's population, and roughly the same population density. In essence, it looks like Ukraine has invaded an area similar to the Ozarks, where I've lived, in terms of both population and terrain. It's sparsely populated, hilly, and has thousands of miles of rivers and streams. Not only are reports of territory seized meaningless, but the conditions under which Ukraine launched its attack carry the strong possibility it was a setup by Russia. I've been discussing in many programs now. I've received information from a source that, in fact, that is exactly what it was. No other commentator I've noticed has picked up on this. I think there's a completely understandable skepticism about this, inability to accept the logic of what this source is saying, even though, as I've pointed out, he was saying this to me 2 months ago, more than 2 months ago now. But anyway, maybe it was a trap, maybe it wasn't. As I said, I don't know what the Russians plan, but as I've said many times, if you're told something all the time, and it turns given information all the time, and that information continues to be corroborated by events, there does come a point when engaging, insisting on skepticism becomes perversity. Anyway, I'm not going to push that further, but notice again what Jim Webb says. Not only are reports of territory seized meaningless, but the conditions under which Ukraine launched its attack carry the strong possibility it was a set-up by Russia. The gap through which Ukraine pushed had recently been demined by Russia, which is consistent with the final stages of how Russia prepares for an offensive. Additionally, there is no evidence that Russia has transferred meaningful numbers of troops from any other sector of the front. This fact alone suggests that there is a significant Russian troop presence, IVO. Further, Russia is attacking in Kharkiv and making a potential breakthrough in Donbass. Continuing to press these attacks is not the reaction of an army in panic mode. It's more likely that Russia deliberately baited Ukraine into attacking Kursk. After all, Russia now has what remains of Ukraine's best men and equipment overextended in a sparsely populated and difficult to traverse region. Not to mention, the Ukrainians are undoubtedly without air cover. To me, it looks like a brewing catastrophe rather than some kind of genius stroke by Ukraine. Well, that was said by Jim Webb, but let's put aside the question of whether or not this was a trap. Look what he says about the terrain. Very sparsely populated. Talking about the 74, or is it 96 now, settlements that Ukraine controls. I'm going to say this. I'm not the best person to look at maps, but when people mention a village in the Donbass, and I go to a map, I have always up to now been able to find it. The same has not been true of Kursk. Many of the places that are mentioned in the various discussions about what's going on here and what's going on there, who's attacking in which direction and all the rest, I cannot find. The reason for that is that they are so small that they're not even villages. Some of them are farmsteads or hamlets, tiny places where just a score or so of people live or used to live, all connected together by very small country roads. The road network in this area is apparently very underdeveloped. There's a main road from Kursk to Sudzha, which has been the target of considerable fighting. But that's about the only big road in this immediate area that exists. All of the other roads are small and pass often through dense woods, and therefore a classic ambush country. And, well, it's not a good place to attack, but more importantly, it's simply not the same sort of place as Donbass is, so that using the kind of metrics that apply to Donbass in order to understand what is happening makes no sense at all. If a place like Zhelanne in Donbass is captured, which the Russians just say, or a village like Progress is captured by the Russians, or Cheretino, or some place like that, these are significant places, because in the checkerboard battle that takes place here, when you have to occupy squares and take pieces in order to be able to move your forces forward. And each village is, if you like, that kind of square. Capturing these places matters. But in Kursk, hardly so. You capture a small place like, let's say, Malaya Loknya. It might not actually lead anywhere or help you very much. It's just one little village in an area of many little villages with streams and hills and forests that don't take you very far. Classic ambush country, in other words, exactly as Jim Webb is describing it. The point about ambush comes from me. Anyway, that's what Jim Webb says. Now, that then also brings me back to another very astute commentator, though as far as I know, though he writes extensively about military matters and has clearly been thinking about them a great deal, I believe that I'm right in saying that this other commentator, Big Serge, is also not a military person, though, as I said, he takes a great deal more interest in them than I do. Anyway, he's discussed the military operation that Ukraine is conducting at great length in a massive piece that he's written on Substack. And there's a number of things I get to say about this article. The first is that he clearly has great difficulty understanding what Ukraine's objectives are. And he goes through a list of objectives that people have suggested, and he debunks them all. And one of the ones that he debunks, and I noticed it right away, is the idea that Ukraine was setting out to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant. He says that there is no actual any evidence of this, and he makes the point that that using the nuclear power plant as some kind of a hostage would be both impractical and unlikely. The plant is currently in a state of transition with its 4 older RBMK reactors, the ones identical to the ones in Chernobyl, by the way, being phased out and replaced with new VVER reactors, which is absolutely true. But I would also point out that it is an operating plant. It is not idle. The plant features modern biologic shields, a robust containment building, and other protective mechanisms. And then he goes on to explain that blowing up nuclear power plants is not a very practical idea, and what ultimately would the Ukrainians gain by it. And he says the power plant story sounds scary, but it's ultimately too phantasmagorical to take seriously. Ukraine is not going to intentionally create a radiological disaster in close proximity to their own border. even for a country at the end of its strategic rope, it's hard to give credence to a harebrained scheme that uses critical maneuver assets to capture an enemy nuclear plant and rig it to blow. But that is not my point. I've never suggested that the Ukrainians were intending to blow up the nuclear power plant. I said that they intended to capture it. And that is not just my opinion, by the way, but it is the opinion also, and I think this point must now be said, it is the opinion of the Russian government. We've had examples of this now from several sources, but the latest is Dmitry Polyansky, Deputy Ambassador of Russia to the United Nations, and someone, by the way, and for the record, who Glenn Deason and I have twice interviewed on the Duran. And he says this, he talks about the fact that Western governments are not speaking out very much about the operation in Kursk. He says it's a very interesting question as to why this is so, because so far they're very timid, and I will say inactive in this regard, because they feel clearly awkward about what is happening in Kursk. First of all, there is almost unanimity in Ukrainian society and in few left unsuppressed media outlets in Ukraine that this is a big strategic blunder. And what's happening right now hasn't achieved any goals that were formulated. And you remember that these goals were the seizure of the Kursk nuclear power plant and then attempts to bargain it with Russia and also secure the withdrawal of Russian detachments from the Eastern Front. So the Russians undoubtedly do think that the Kursk nuclear power plant was the objective, and going back to other Russian sources, Abdi Alaudinov has told us, has actually publicly said that the Russians now know the full plan and that the plan was to capture the power plant on the 11th of August by the 5th day. The idea was not to blow it up or to threaten to blow it up or to do anything like that. It was to capture the power plant and, I am sure, to dare the Russians to try to retake it, which the Russians, as George Beebe recently said in another article, which is a bit on responsible statecraft, they might be under extreme international pressure not to risk. And if the Russians were put off launching a military operation intended to regain control of the nuclear power plant, to leverage Ukrainian control of the nuclear power plant, to secure a ceasefire, at least a localized ceasefire, and perhaps ultimately a general ceasefire across the battlefronts, and perhaps a swap with the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and other territories. That, I think, was the plan. And as I said, there is no other explanation. There is no other explanation for what the Ukrainians intended to do, because, as Jim Webb has pointed out, and by the way, as Big Serge has pointed out, there is ultimately nothing else there. And in fact, interestingly, Big Serge goes through all the other possible theories about why the Ukrainians might have wanted to launch this attack in Kursk. He dismisses every single one. He only gives as a possible explanation the very nebulous one that the Ukrainians were trying to restart maneuver warfare rather than the kind of grinding attritional warfare that they've been maneuvered into by the Russians, which, in my opinion, is not a plan or an idea, and certainly not one that around which an entire military operation would be based. A military operation must have an objective, And the only one in this territory is the nuclear power plant. Anyway, I've said enough about this. I don't want to give the impression, by the way, that I'm criticising Big Serge, because I'm not. I think in every other respect but that one, I think this is an excellent article and one that people should certainly read, because it takes us to the reality of what is going on the actual battlefronts in Kursk. And he goes on to say that what he chooses to call Operation Krepost, Operation Fortress. I'm not sure why, by the way. I would simply call it the Kursk operation. I don't think there's any reason to think that that will cause any confusion with the great battle that took place in Kursk in 1943, by the way. Just saying. But anyway, the biggest problem is that it distracts from the most important facts about the operation in Kursk, which is, to quote, the results on the ground are not very good. The attack has been both limited in scale and constrained in its advance, but the shock and surprise of the operation has allowed the narrative to spin out of control. And then he discusses, firstly, the cobbled together nature of the Ukrainian force that has attacked in Kursk, elements of 5 mechanized brigades and 2 air assault brigades, the incredible mishmash of armor, different types of armor, and he gives lists of the extraordinary range of armored vehicles that have been deployed in the battle. He points out that this means that Ukraine, even to an even greater extent, and even in this attack, drawing on its best units, is now having to amalgamate them increasingly into sort of Frankenstein units. And he then discusses the course of the fighting. And he says that whilst the initial features of the terrain were helpful to the Ukrainians, the area is heavily forested, which enabled the Ukrainians to conceal their forces. Once the element of surprise had dissipated, the situation began to turn against them. And he said that the Ukrainian advance on Sudzha began to bog down almost immediately as the Russians scrambled reinforcements into the area. The Ukrainians spent most of August 7th and 8th consolidating positions to the north of Sudzha and working to envelop the town, which sits at the bottom of a valley. They eventually capture the town. That is what the Ukrainians claim. The Russians still claim, by the way, that they hold some positions in the outskirts. I think what the Russians probably hold are some outlying semi-villages. I think we must conclude now that the metropolitan area of Sudzha, about 5,000 people, is under Ukrainian control. But then, going back to Big Serge, they eventually captured the town, but the delay cost them precious days and allowed the Russians to move reinforcements into the theatre. And then he then goes on to discuss that the Russians have now basically stopped the further Ukrainian advances. And then he describes overall the terrain. And he says many of the same things about the terrain in a kind of a way that Jim Webb is saying. A fairly dispersed area with streams and small roads. The Ukrainian position around Sudzha is road-poor region connected to the rear area on the Ukrainian side of the border by only a handful of exposed roads which offer no concealment. This leaves the Ukrainian logistical tail highly vulnerable to strikes by Landsets and FPV drones. Furthermore, attempts to properly exploit the advance require the Ukrainians to bring precious assets close to the border, exposing them to attack. So the result is that the Ukrainians have become entangled in this place of small villages, forests, roads, streams, subject to constant ambushes and unable to make significant further advances. And then he talks about, I'm talking, going back to Big Serge again, he talks about the attempts by the Ukrainians possibly to advance into the area south of the Siem River, where they've been busy blowing up bridges. They've made no attempts, by the way, to do that so far, at least not that I'm aware of, or at least not as of the time that I'm making this program. And he says, well, even if the Ukrainians capture this territory, where, by the way, I understand that another Russian Marine brigade is now stationed, what good ultimately will it do them? And I think this is exactly right. I think this is exactly to the point. And Big Serge also makes the point that when the Russians began the Kharkiv operation, part of the rationale clearly was to force the Ukrainians to divert troops from the Donbass to hold off a Russian advance towards Kharkiv and Volchansk and other places. But the Ukrainians have now done this to themselves to an even greater extent than the Russians could have ever imagined by themselves, moving elements of no fewer than 7 brigades to the territory, to the Sumy region and to Kursk region, themselves stripping their forces in Donbass of troops. And he's absolutely right. He said that it has now become clear that the decision to divert forces to Kursk has undermined the already precarious defense of Donbass. Ukraine holds Sudzha and may very well clear the south bank of the Sem, but if it comes at the expense of Pokrovsk and Toretsk, that is a trade the Russian army will be happy to make. The Ukrainians have expended, carefully husbanded, and scarce resources in the pursuit of operationally inconsequential objectives. The exhilaration of taking the fight to Russia and being on the attack again can certainly work wonders for morale and create a spectacle for Western backers, but the effect is short-lived, like a broke man gambling away his last dollar, all for the momentary thrill of chance. Well, that's Big Serge. Another expert, a military professional, has apparently said exactly the same thing. Now here I have to be a bit careful because I'm getting the account of what this person has said at second hand. I haven't been able to find the interview, but I believe it has been given on a site called military.com, which is one of the unending number of American military professional magazines, read a lot by people interested in joining the military and also by veterans, and I suspect members of the serving military. It's actually an interesting magazine. I don't want to appear to be knocking it here. Anyway, the person I'm going to talk about now is General Bradley Gerike. I might be pronouncing his name completely wrongly. If so, my big apologies. And Bloomberg, I've seen on Bloomberg a summary of what he's been saying to military.com. I ought to say that so far as I'm aware, General Geritske, however his name is pronounced, is absolutely he's in no sense any kind of sympathizer with the Russians, or he's involved with the Atlantic Council. So, I mean, he's got, I'm guessing, all the conventional views, let's put it like this, of a member of the American military political establishment. I just want to throw that in as well. But anyway, he tells us that there has been an absolutely grotesque mismatch between what this Kursk operation is expending, the cost that Ukraine is paying for it, and what it is actually achieving. He says that, he puts it this way, that Ukraine has made no real significant gains at all. It's not captured anything of any importance, but its losses are horrendous. He is even comparing this operation with the debacle of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I think, coming from an American officer, military officer, is extremely scathing criticism, just to say, by the way. And he, again, says exactly the same thing as Big Serge is saying, that the Ukrainians are destroying their own material and manpower, best manpower, in this absolutely isolated corner, completely remote from the main battlefield. By the way, Big Serge also makes that identical point. This battle is completely detached geographically from the main battle, which is playing out in Donbass. It has no bearing on what goes on anywhere in Donbass. If the Russians capture Volchansk in Kharkiv region, it has an effect on the course of events in Donbass. Capturing villages in Kursk region, or losing villages in Kursk region, has no direct bearing on anything that happens in Donbass. And on the subject of Ukrainian equipment losses, a number of people are now saying, including, by the way, Big Serge, just to say, but I've seen this now being said by a number of people, that the rate of loss of tanks and armoured vehicles that the Ukrainians are suffering in the Kursk offensive is comparable in absolute numbers to the loss rate, to the losses, not loss rate, the losses of tanks and armoured vehicles that the Ukrainians suffered in the Zaporozhye offensive around Rabotino. Now that is astonishing, and it seems to be true. Now let's, at this point, get to what the Russians are telling us about the situation on the Kursk battlefield. And again, we've had reports both from Group of Forces North and from the Russian Defense Ministry. And I'll go firstly, as I generally do, to what Group of Forces North say. They've, as always, provided us with their own rather colourful account of the battle, which is always interesting, and as I said, always has an interesting personality behind it. Anyway, Group of Forces North tell us that over the course of the 24 hours, the Ukrainians, the Group of Forces North repulsed another Ukrainian attack on Korenovo, and that this attack was carried out by a platoon of infantry fighting vehicles and 2 armoured vehicles. The enemy lost 11 men and 1 armoured vehicle. And by the way, Group of Forces North categorically deny reports, which I was seeing appear yesterday, that the Ukrainians have captured Korenovo. They say that control of Korenovo is with the Russian troops. The enemy also attempted a breakthrough near the villages of Komarovka and Olgovka, but was unsuccessful and withdrew with heavy losses. 3 Ukrainian troops were captured. Again, note that Komarovka and Olgovka are all connected with the fighting in Korenovo. This is another attack there. The Russians clearly indicating that they control these 2 villages. Then they say, in the direction of Sudzha, fierce fighting continues in the area of Cherkasskoye Porechnoye, where the Ukrainians with up to 30 troops and 2 infantry fighting vehicles attacked the village. Fire damage was inflicted. Up to 8 soldiers, enemy soldiers, were killed. The enemy was thrown back. Now again, there were reports yesterday that the Ukrainians had broken through in this area and had captured Martinovka. This report doesn't mention Martinovka, but it appears to deny it. And comments made both by Radovka and Alaudinov suggest that there's been actually no change in who is in control of what in this area. And then Group of Forces North tell us the intensity of Ukrainian attacks in Kursk region has decreased, and with it the quality and motivation of the advancing contingent. Up to a certain point, the enemy's assaults were stopped after reaching 50% casualties. Now this figure barely reaches 25%. Ukrainian assault troops are fleeing after the first serious attack or destroyed drone, many surrendering at once. And then they go on to say that over the course of the fighting yesterday, 390, the Ukrainians lost 390 men killed and wounded, of whom 300 were killed and wounded in Sumy region, where the Ukrainians also lost 3 tanks. By the way, most of these losses are not happening as a result of fighting. It's the result of Russian artillery strikes and bombing, or so it seems to me. The Russians also say that they are continuing, by the way, to advance, or at least Group of Forces North are saying that they're continuing to advance in the area of the apartment buildings in Volchansk. Clearly slow progress there, but they are gradually moving forward, or so they say. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has now provided its own account, and I will just read it out in a little bit more detail. They say units of the Group of Forces North have thwarted attacks launched by enemy assault detachments in the directions of Komarovka, Korenovo, Malaya Noknia. Again, the Russians clearly indicating that they control this village, and Ruskaya Konopelka. That, I believe, is located to the west of Sudzha. Ukrainian losses were more than 45 troops killed and wounded, 2 of them captured, 2 tanks, 1 US-made M113 armoured personnel carrier, and 6 armoured vehicles. The Russian forces continue reconnaissance and search operations to locate and eliminate enemy sabotage and reconnaissance groups attempting to get to the depth of Russian territory. And here I have to say we've heard less about these. The Defense Ministry gives no reports. I think the Ukrainians have, for the moment at least, largely stopped sending out reconnaissance troops. All that happens is that they get destroyed, men are killed or taken prisoner. And then the Russians talk about the fact that they've conducted air and artillery strikes on Ukrainian troops of the 22nd Brigade, the 115th Mechanized Brigade, and the 82nd Air Assault Brigade in Kursk region. And they give lists of the places close to where these attacks happen. And then they also describe heavy attacks, bombing and missile strikes on Ukrainian concentrations in Sumy region. And they say that over the course of the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 300 troops, killed and wounded, same figure as the one given by Group of Forces North, 26 armoured vehicles, including 6 tanks, 3 armoured personnel carriers, 17 armoured fighting vehicles. And then total losses are 4,400 Ukrainian troops, 65 tanks, 27 infantry fighting vehicles, 53 armoured personnel carriers, 316 armoured fighting vehicles, and various other pieces of equipment. So, this operation, the Kursk operation, strategic blunder, more and more people are saying that, and notice that those who have professional military backgrounds are gradually coalescing around this theme. The people who continue to speak of this operation as some kind of great success tend either to be civilians in the West or those few lost souls who, it seems to me, have lost all objectivity in the way that they factually describe things. And in the meantime, as I discussed earlier in the program, the military situation crumbles in Donbass. I do ask myself, what exactly is going on in Kiev? Do they understand this? Why are they doubling down on a gamble that has failed? It again goes back to what Big Serge says, that it's like a broke man gambling away his last dollar, all for the momentary thrill of chance. Do they really believe that redeploying the 47th Mechanized Brigade, already badly battered by over a year of constant fighting, is going to change the situation? It can change the situation in Pokrovsk, but it won't change it in Kursk. And what does changing the situation in Kursk even mean? I'm not sure I understand. I'm starting to think that we are in the last months of this war and that Medvedev is going to get what he wants, which is total victory in Ukraine. Because these latest actions by the Ukrainians have brought this event so much closer. Alaudinov is now predicting final victory within 2 to 3 months. We'll see whether or not he's right. Well, this is where I end my program today. As again, a long program. I hope we've overcome our connectivity issues. Let me remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and go to our shop. You can find links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.